Okay, and welcome back. So we're on to another episode of the Martial View today, and today we have a super special guest who I'm slightly fangirling over, so you'll have to excuse me. It is the incredible Richard Norton. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. I'm sure we'll have a really good chat. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that everyone should already know you, but if they don't, can you just quickly and briefly introduce yourself?
Oh God, here we go. Well, I grew up in Melbourne, Australia. Started martial arts when I was 11 years of age. Karate in my mid-teens. Went to the started a style with my partner Bob Jones, which we called Zendikar. That was in 1970. It was a very eclectic style, meaning it was one of the first styles to actually start mixing martial arts, a little bit like so much of the environment now, but we kind of started it way back. So I'm giving this is very quick and we'll go into detail. So in 73, I started doing personal bodyguard work, starting with the Rolling Stones. ABBA, Joe Cocker, James Taylor, Linda Ronstadt, David Bowie, a whole slew. Went to the United States in 1979 to work full-time for a very famous rock and roll singer at that stage, Linda Ronstadt. She was as big as Beyonce in her day. Me to come and work for her. And the year before, in 1978, Bob Jones had gone to America, arranged for Chuck Norris to come to Australia. So I met Chuck in 78. We formed a friendship. He said, give me a call if you ever get to California, which was the following year. And so, of course, the first person I called when I got to California was Chuck. We started training every morning. He wanted me to play his nemesis in the Octagon, one of his early action movies. That started a movie career. So for quite a while, I was doing movies and still doing bodyguard work, and of course training with some amazing, amazing martial artists while I was in the US. And the journey continues. Did probably 80 movies of various sorts. TV as well. The last 5 years has seen me doing mainly fight coordinating, because I always joke at my age you either get to play somebody's dad or an aging gangster. So, but that's okay. I'm still involved in everything and still using my martial arts. So life is good, and as I said, it's still going.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, perfect. Let's get straight into it then, and probably one of the most common questions that you get asked. But why did you begin in the martial arts? You said that you started as a young child. What actually initially attracted you towards it?
Yeah, look, look at this. You see this? This is
No, that's fine. Go for it.
A little bit of sparkling.
Enjoy. Yeah.
Look, I've been asked that question a lot, and I know, the typical answer is, grew up in a rough neighborhood gangs, and needed to learn how to fight. But that wasn't the case with me. I grew up in Croydon, a suburb of Melbourne, and I had a really good, safe upbringing. I mean, we sort of did it hard like everybody else, but it wasn't like there were street fights going on and rough gangs and anything like that. Sure. I remember, though, even 9, 10, 11 years of age, very physical. I used to play around with a friend of mine up the street. We'd put on boxing gloves and do all that. So there was some sort of natural attraction to all things, pugilistic. But I got attracted to judo, and believe it or not, this is the truth. It was really through looking at ads on the back of comic books. I mean, you used to get comic books and they'd advertise judo. And for back then, this is 1961. So it was there was a very mystical lure to Asian martial arts, especially judo and later on karate. So it was just some sort of attraction I had, and really how I ended up at the judo class, knowing about judo was comic books. But a friend or a new kid moved into a house opposite to where I lived in Croydon, and he was disappearing twice a week. And I ended up saying, "Oh, Morris, where are you going?" And he was going to judo classes, and I was like, "Oh my God, I've got to go. I want to go with you." So his dad would drive us down there. It was a police sergeant that was running the judo classes. And, I went, and I like to say, I think I'm reminded of the cartoon characters in some of these cartoons with you getting smacked from one end of the dojo to the other, because I was very skinny and very small as an 11-year-old. And I remember the older teenage judo guys kind of using me as cannon fodder.
Yeah.
But still, that was okay. I was lured in, and another friend of ours that went to high school with us told Morris and I about a karate school opening up 3 miles from where we lived.
Okay.
And this gentleman, Tino Severano, he was a Hawaiian Filipino.
Yeah.
And he had been out in Australia 6 months, and he was opening up, introducing Goju-Ryu, Okinawan, or in that, it was more of a Japanese version of Goju that he was introducing into Australia, which he had learned in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And he did a demo, and I went along to this demonstration, and I saw it, and I was just transfixed. I said, oh my God, this is what I want to do. Especially as a smaller person, because it was more standoff, involved, striking, kicking, and more about agility rather than the strength that judo initially requires. And I say today, and I still mean it, that I just feel that I was attracted to it because, as cliche as it sounds, I believe that's what I was meant to do with my life.
Sure.
Because I started at 11, I'm 70 years of age now, and the journey still goes on. So that's really what it was about for me, And remember, back then, as I said, there was only judo. Karate almost didn't exist. I believe there was a few karate schools, not that I was aware of them. Tino basically introduced karate as we know it into Australia. And as I said, the rest is history, the way the martial arts developed well in all countries, not just Australia.
Yeah, definitely. Perfect. Okay. You mentioned then forming the Zendikar. So how did that come about? Why did you decide to kind of form your own organization, your own style? Was that a challenge to do? What did you want from it?
Well, Bob Jones was a gentleman that was 10 years older than I was, who also had done a little bit of karate at this school that I didn't know about, of course, and he started with Tino. We became very good friends, and it was Bob who wanted to leave and start up his own system.
Okay.
And I tell you, a lot of the impetus was that Bob had a huge reputation in the streets, as it were. He used to run security and do bodyguard work, even back in the 60s, outside clubs and pubs and everything.
Yeah.
And, and I started working doors when I was still a teenager as a result of that. But I was the one who wanted to start a school. And one of the driving forces was so many of the people who wanted somewhere to train, wanted somewhere really to improve their skills, hence Zendikar. Zendikar still had a Goju base, Japanese, we bowed, we did all the traditional things that the Japanese would do in the dojo. But we added a lot of stuff. We added boxing and grappling, because what was important for our clientele and students then was that it would work on a door or in a bar or whatever in the course of the job. So I would like to say that what we were doing in the early 70s is what everybody does now, meaning back then we were mixing martial arts, and still with a real passion for the tradition. We still did kata, we did all that stuff. And as I said, the etiquette of the dojo was still adhered to, but again, with the influx of a realistic aspect of what would really work out of the plethora of martial art techniques that were out there.
Yeah.
And then, that school, at one stage we had, goodness me, there was almost 1,000 schools throughout Australia, some twice a week, some full time. It was a huge organization. Again, I was with Bob, I was his right-hand man, but the brainchild, of course, was Bob Jones.
Yeah.
But it was the start of not only an incredible system that still goes today. I'm still heading up in a lot of ways. Bob's in town. I'm still heading it up here in Australia. But it not only was it a system for Australia, but it also set me on a journey that I could never have imagined. Meaning the bodyguard work and the movies really came as a result of my collaboration with Bob Zendikar, getting into bodyguard work, meeting Chuck Norris, et cetera,
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, fantastic. Perfect. Okay, so you said then that the bodyguarding, the Hollywood stuff, the acting, meeting Chuck Norris, it all kind of snowballed from meeting Bob Jones and forming the Zendikar with him. In what way did that come about then? So let's start with the bodyguarding. How did that begin? Yeah, how did you get into it?
As I'd mentioned earlier, Bob used to run a big security company, for clubs.
Yeah.
I always laugh because back then there were, a lot of live music clubs, things like that, and later on discos. Every time we say discos, it really ages us. But there you go. But we were already, I was already working on doors, as were a lot of the students at Zendikar.
Yeah.
And we did a big pop concert. It was like our version of Woodstock, called Sunbury.
Right.
And Paul Dainty was an Australian entrepreneur who used to bring a lot of the big bands out to Australia.
Sure.
He was involved in that. And as a result of that, in I think it was late 72, might have been early 73, Paul Dainty called Bob and asked if we would be interested in looking after the Rolling Stones. He was bringing them out to Australia. And by the way, this is just a little while after Altamont, which is a notorious thing when the Hells Angel bikie ended up killing one of the punters, in front of the stage. A little while after that. Anyway, he asked if we'd do it, so we did. So Bob and I ended up being personal bodyguards for the Stones in 73. And that really started it all because it was such a successful thing for Paul. All the other bands he brought out after that, some of the ones I mentioned, Fleetwood Mac, David Bowie, Linda Ronstadt, James Taylor, Joe Cocker, sure. He got us to take the job on of looking after them. And I like to say too that people ask, well, how do you get into a job like that? Well, we got the Jones, the Rolling Stones gig, and because Paul knew, first of all, we could be trusted. Second of all, we wouldn't just haul off and be violent, punch anybody with a hell of it. In other words, we were very professional the way we went about it. Sure. Third of all, importantly, look at me. I look anything but like a bodyguard. Bob had long hair. So we had the ability to more or less blend in and look like a member of the band. Yeah. That was also a very attractive thing for acts coming up because a lot of them didn't like big heavy overtones, guys with arms folded, creating a kind of a dark sort of cloud. Yeah. We could, because when we worked with them, when I used to travel with the band and when I went to America, I had adjoining rooms every lunch or dinner they went to, or go to a club, or go with David Bowie sometimes just to a nightclub or whatever. It was important that I almost looked like just a friend as opposed to security. But the flip side of that is that they also knew that they always had somebody there should something go wrong. That was my job to handle it. I was such a fitness nut. There was never even an instant where I considered doing any sort of drug. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke. Sure. So it meant, and we're talking about the 70s and 80s, pretty wild times for rock and roll bands. And they at least knew that, and I knew also that if everybody got so out of it and got so shit-faced, they needed to know that there was at least one person with a level and straight head that could look after things should it be required. And so it's a word of mouth thing, as much as anything, a lot of the people that toured in these bands kind of knew each other. So it was kind of cool that they would talk about these Australian bodyguards they had, which was almost like a reference that you couldn't get any other way. In other words, you couldn't get a job doing what we did by sending in a resume to the manager. Yeah, and, well, I was special forces and I did this, because it was a very different kind of a feel as far as what they required out of being a bodyguard.
Perfect. You've mentioned these massive names then, so you've mentioned the Rolling Stones, Fleetwood Mac, David Bowie. Probably what people think of then is, do they have a persona that's on stage, and what were they like off stage then? Because obviously you got to know them in a very personal aspect. Most people will never get to do that. So what was the difference between knowing who they were on stage and what kind of massive stars they were in comparison to, if you say, go with David Bowie to a club in a more relaxed setting? So what were they like as people?
No, it's a really good question, Dan, because I often say that most of the time, I could give an example, like when I started working with David, first of all, he challenged me to a one-arm push-up competition in this restaurant. Yeah, well, come on. but, you know, which is pretty funny. David, to me, was almost, first of all, he's one of the most intelligent people that I'd ever met. He was so well read. He used to dress a bit like an English gentleman, you know. In other words, people would think of David and they'd think of the Ziggy Stardust look and all the makeup and the red hair and all the different phases. And I remember we were at a show once and I was standing with David and he said to me, we looked at all the kids and he said, Rich, have a look at them all. He said, they're all dressed the same way I was on the last tour. He said, they'll never catch me looking the same. It was like a chameleon. And he studied mime, you know, he was very, even the way he'd pull a cigarette out of the packet was all so structured. But this was a persona that he developed. He always wanted to stay one step ahead of what anybody's expectations could be of him. Not just in the way he dressed and the way he looked, but also his music. Step outside of that, and he's just another guy that has a passion, an absolute passion for what he does.
Sure.
And, you know, like even in Mick Jagger, you know, I used to get to, you know, not a lot, but sometimes train Mick at 4 o'clock in the morning, teaching him karate punches and stuff. Because he was very aware of being fit and healthy and all of that. And, you know, again, it's a funny story for me. They'll probably kill me, but we went out to a club one day, and I remember being at this nightclub with Mick and Keith Richards. Bill Wyman wasn't there. He was in the band at that time, but Bill would never go out with him. He used to just like to stay by himself and everything. Okay. But I remember there was a kind of a cute girl on the, you know, near the dance floor and everything, and I had this conversation with Keith and Mick, and it's almost like Keith said, "Go and ask her." Oh no. It was like us being there and feeling like, gee, you don't want to go over and ask her. Go, what if she said no? Then I'm going to look like a complete idiot. In other words, like me though, knowing that any young lady in that club would have their tongues hanging out and would have jumped at you in time with them. But it was a very human sort of thing, you know, to see that. They were like, oh, they weren't sure whether they should go over and talk to this young lady at the club. And I thought, how funny is that? And so I look at somebody like Lindsey Buckingham in Fleetwood Mac. There wasn't a time on the tour bus that you wouldn't see Lindsey strumming that guitar, trying to find a new chord, trying to hit a new note, all of this sort of stuff. And so what you don't sort of see, aside from just everyday regular people, what a lot of people miss, I believe, especially out of the ones that last, is the absolute passion they have for what they do, for their craft. You know, I said in an interview a little while ago, I watched a Netflix documentary on Keith Richards, and he's got to be close to 80, you know. Sure. But still, the absolute passion that Keith had for his music and songwriting and everything, still at that age, you realize that's what he lives for, that's what he is. And yet the perception of a lot of people who will look at someone like Keith, all they see is the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sure. But they miss the passion of an artist, of somebody, because you don't last in the industry as long as someone like the Stones or a James Taylor or Linda Ronstadt or a David Bowie when he was still alive, of course, without having an absolute passion for what you do. Yeah. And I feel so fortunate I was around to see that passion, to see them off stage, to understand that again, that on-stage persona is one thing they create. There's almost an expectation that the crowd would have of them, not only on stage with their behavior in a press reception or whatever. And then you're alone in the hotel room and you're chatting to them and you get to see the real person. And it was a wonderful thing. And even Bill Wyman back in the day, he would get a separate room on a separate floor to them. Okay. Because he said, I can't hang with them. You know, he would get a book on whatever area we're in it, read up on it. He was so well read. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. That's how they get to last, because they've also worked out how to cohabitate with each other. Sure, yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. Understand their personality. They understand, you do that, but I'm not into that. they're still mates, they're still friends when they go on stage. It's such a cohesive group. But I saw a lot of that. I saw a lot of that human side to them. And as I said, I feel very fortunate to have a chance. John Belushi's a good example. It's not quite, I was working with John when he made the Blues Brothers movie.
Yeah, yeah.
Which, how cool is that? Not only am I working with him, I was also training him a little bit, which is a pretty funny experience. Lovely guy, had a heart of gold, extravagant in every way, whether it's eating or drugs or whatever, but still an amazing person. And, working on the Blues Brothers, I got to meet Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles and people like that. And again, to hear John or with Danny Aykroyd or whatever, again, aside from the little characters he play on Saturday Night Live or whatever, again, you just got to see an amazing person. And again, I just keep saying I feel so fortunate.
Do you think they recognize kind of a kindred spirit in you then? You said that they were so passionate about what they did and about their music or their acting or the directing or whatever they were doing. Do you think they noticed that in you and how passionate you were towards the martial arts in terms of what you were doing at that time? Do you think that's why you gelled?
That's an interesting question. You know what? Yes. In that, especially back then in the 70s, I mean, I was fanatical with training. I was fanatical with diet. I used to fast. I was into all these things. So a lot of what I would do is encourage members of the bands to work out. I used to train David, ABBA, the Swedish pop group ABBA. I worked with ABBA. I trained the girls virtually every day we had an opportunity. You're down the beach, swimming pool, tough gig, right? Somebody had to do it. But, so they got a chance to see the passion I had for being fit, for being healthy, for martial arts. James Taylor, I'd go to Martha's Vineyard in the early days when he was still married to Carly Simon, and we would do bow work, which is a long staff, oriental weapon, and I would train him in the bow. I'd set up a punching bag in the dressing room just before he'd go on stage so he could punch it, let off a bit of steam, as it were, channel a bit of adrenaline. So they got to see what I did. And they had an appreciation for my passion, the same as they had a passion for either their instrument or songwriting or performing. Because David, in fact, I think why I was told by his assistant why David wanted me to work with him outside of Australia, overseas in America, which I did for quite a number of years, is he actually came along to a class I taught in New Zealand, which was great. He sat and watched the class, and I was told he was just enthralled because it gave him an appreciation for my ability, as an artist with what I was teaching and everything. So, all of that's pretty cool. Linda, I used to train Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor. I trained them as hard as any black belt with sit-ups and push-ups and stretching and teach them kata or forms and things like that. And they loved it. And one of the reasons they liked it, by the way, is first of all, it was a balance to being on the road, because being on the road is tough. And not, if you're traveling country to country, not so bad. But when you're in the US and you're in a different city every night, you're continually in a tour bus or on a plane, that's tough. So the balance was them to actually come off the road almost in better shape than when they went on, which was quite an anomaly, back then.
Yeah.
So So it's an interesting observation that I think they did appreciate a lot of what I did, and mutual respect is very important, because for me, I always had a certain amount of pride in what I had achieved as a martial artist, and it's important that there was a crossing of that respect. I certainly wouldn't have done it if I was just a number on a call sheet, for whatever it is you're going to do. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Who was your best student then, do you think? Can you answer that?
Probably James. James Taylor worked incredibly hard, and he was a good athlete. He got in such amazing shape. He was very driven. The great thing with James was into certain substances, and I'm not giving away secrets because I wouldn't do that. I would never do a kiss and tell on any of these people I work with because I was around them all the time, so I knew everything.
Yeah.
But James makes no secret of the fact that he had certain substance abuse, and the beauty of it is that it got to where he said to me that exercise is now my addiction. He stopped smoking, stopped doing all this other stuff for years and years, and it's been many, many, many years since he's even touched anything. And I feel if I was in some small way a bit of a guiding force in that regard, then again, how good is that? In fact, James came to Australia a few years ago now, and his tour manager tracked Judy and I down, my wife and I down, and he flew us to Sydney from Melbourne just to hang out with him and his wife and his kids for a few days. And that was fantastic because I hadn't seen James in a long time, and it was almost like yesterday where you realized you weren't just an employee, but you actually formed a friendship. And Carole King was on that tour, you know, and anyone who knows Carole King wrote some amazing, amazing songs for the Everly Brothers, of course, James.
Yeah.
And James introduced me to Carole and said, Richard changed my life. And I thought, oh man, pretty good.
Very cool, yeah.
Very, very special little moments. So, yeah.
Brilliant.